May 15, 1944. Iowa, United States. The train screeched to a stop, and 200 German prisoners stepped into air so thick with silence, it felt like judgment itself. They had crossed the Atlantic in chains, packed into the belly of transport ships where the smell of salt mixed with fear. For 17 days, they heard nothing but the sound of waves crashing against steel and the whispers of men who believed they were sailing toward their execution. They expected camps, wire fences stretching into horizons, guard towers with rifles pointed down at them like the fingers of God. They expected hatred, pure, distilled, American hatred, the kind they had been told about in every propaganda film, every military briefing, every whispered conversation in the trenches of France. But when the doors of that train opened and their boots touched American soil for the first time, something was wrong. The guards weren't screaming. There were no dogs, no beatings, no rifles pressed against their spines. Instead, they were met with silence. And then, something even more confusing, they were offered breakfast. If stories like this matter to you, listen closely. Because what happened in the farmlands of Iowa between 1944 and 1946 wasn't just a footnote in history. It was a quiet revolution, one that dismantled everything these men believed about their enemies, about their war, and about themselves. This is the story of men who arrived as soldiers of the Third Reich and left questioning whether the war they fought was ever about what they were told it was about. This isn't a story about heroes. It's not about villains either. It's about the moment when the enemy stops being a concept and becomes a man sitting across from you, pouring you coffee with hands that look exactly like your father's. History doesn't repeat itself, but it echoes, and if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the sound of forks scraping plates in a farmhouse kitchen in 1944, where 200 German prisoners sat down to eat and began to understand that everything they knew was a lie. The fields stretched endlessly, painted in the gray of dawn. Every shadow looked like a memory refusing to fade. The air was heavy with the scent of wet earth and manure, smells that reminded the prisoners of home, of villages they hadn't seen in years, of farms their grandfathers had worked before the war swallowed them whole. The prisoners stood in formation outside the barracks, waiting for orders, waiting for punishment, waiting for the war to continue, just on different soil with different guards, but the same violence they had learned to expect. But the guards didn't shout. They didn't strike. They simply pointed toward a building with smoke rising from its chimney, curling into the pale morning sky like a question mark. One prisoner, a man named Klaus Werner, 26 years old, a former schoolteacher from Bavaria, stood frozen at the edge of the formation. His hands were still numb from the cold of the ship. His uniform was torn at the shoulder. His boots were 2 sizes too small, stolen from a dead Russian soldier in Stalingrad. He had not eaten a full meal in 4 months. He watched the smoke rise, and for the first time since his capture, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Confusion. Not fear, not anger, just confusion. Because in his training, in every briefing, in every speech delivered by officers with iron crosses pinned to their chests, he had been told that Americans were weak, that they were soft, that they would torture prisoners, abuse them, humiliate them. Because that's what enemies do. That's what war is. But as he walked toward that building, flanked by guards who looked more bored than hostile, Klaus began to feel the edges of his certainty crumble. Inside, the tables were set. Not with rations, not with scraps, but with real food. Eggs, scrambled and still steaming. Toast, golden and buttered. Coffee, real coffee, not the chicory sludge they drank in the trenches. Bacon, crispy and layered on metal trays that reflected the morning light. The prisoners stopped in the doorway. Some stared. Others turned to each other, whispering in German, their voices low and panicked, as if speaking too loud would shatter the illusion and reveal the punishment they were certain was coming. One guard, a young man, maybe 22, with blonde hair and blue eyes that could have belonged to any soldier in the Wehrmacht, stepped forward and said in perfect German, "Sit down, eat." Klaus looked at him. then at the food, then back at the guard. "Why?" Klaus asked. The guard shrugged. "Because you're hungry." They expected hatred. Instead, they were offered breakfast. The enemy spoke their language, even shared their names. By 1944, the United States was home to more than 12 million people of German descent. In states like Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, entire towns still spoke German at home. Churches held services in German. Newspapers printed in Gothic script still circulated in rural communities, despite the war. The language of the enemy was also the language of grandmothers baking bread, of fathers teaching their sons how to plant corn, of entire communities who had left Germany decades ago but still carried it in their bones. And now, standing guard over German prisoners of war, were men whose last names were Schmidt, Müller, Zimmermann, and Becker. Men whose fathers had fled Germany to escape poverty or war or persecution. Men who spoke the same language as the prisoners they were guarding, who sang the same songs their grandmothers had sung, who remembered the same folk tales told around the same kinds of fires. The war had turned into a mirror, and for the prisoners, that mirror reflected something they were never told, something their officers never mentioned, something the propaganda films never showed, that the enemy looked exactly like them. Klaus sat at the table, his fork trembling in his hand. Across from him was another prisoner, younger, maybe 19, with a face still soft with youth despite the dirt smudged across his cheeks. His name was Otto. He had been conscripted at 17. He had never fired his rifle in combat. He had been captured in France, hiding in a barn, crying. Otto leaned forward and whispered, "They're trying to break us, make us forget. This is propaganda." But Klaus didn't answer, because when he lifted that fork to his mouth and tasted eggs, real eggs, not powdered, not rationed, something inside him cracked. Not his loyalty, not his pride, his certainty. All his life Klaus had been told who the enemy was. In school they taught him that Americans were greedy, that they had no culture, no honor, no discipline. In the Hitler Youth they taught him that Americans were cowards who hid behind their machines. In the Wehrmacht they taught him that Americans were subhuman, unworthy of respect, unworthy of mercy. But now, sitting in this farmhouse kitchen in Iowa, eating food prepared by the enemy, guarded by men who spoke his language and looked like his cousins, Klaus felt the entire architecture of his beliefs begin to collapse. Because if the enemy treats you like a human being, if the enemy feeds you, speaks to you, sees you as something other than a monster, then what does that make you? What does that make the war you fought? What does that make every order you followed, every city you burned, every life you took in the name of a Führer who told you that mercy was weakness and compassion was treason? The prisoners ate in silence. Some cried. Others stared at their plates, unable to process what was happening. A few refused to eat, convinced it was poisoned, convinced it was a trick, convinced that any moment now the guards would laugh and drag them outside and execute them one by one. But the guards didn't laugh. They just stood by the door, watching, waiting, as 200 men slowly realized that the world was not what they had been told it was. That night, in the barracks, the prisoners spoke in hushed voices. The building was long and narrow, with rows of metal bunks stacked too high. The windows were small and covered with thin curtains that let in the moonlight but kept out the wind. Outside, the Iowa countryside stretched into darkness, silent except for the occasional bark of a dog or the distant hum of a truck on a gravel road. Klaus lay on his bunk, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the breakfast in his mind, the taste of the coffee, the warmth of the toast, the way the guard had smiled when he said, "Because you're hungry." It was such a simple answer, too simple. And yet it haunted him. Around him other prisoners were arguing. Some were angry. They called it propaganda, a trick, an insult. They said the Americans were trying to make them weak, trying to make them forget their duty, trying to turn them into traitors. "They want us to betray the fatherland," one prisoner said, his voice sharp and bitter. His name was Friedrich, a sergeant from Prussia, a man who still believed in the war, who still believed in the cause. They feed us so we forget. They smile at us so we doubt. But we are soldiers. We do not break. But another prisoner, a quiet man named Hans, older than the rest, with gray in his beard and scars on his hands, shook his head slowly. We already broke, he said. We broke the moment we surrendered. Friedrich turned on him, eyes blazing. We were captured. We didn't surrender. What's the difference? Hans asked. The room went silent. Klaus sat up. He looked at Friedrich, then at Hans, then at the dozen other men scattered across the bunks, all of them wrestling with the same question, the same doubt, the same creeping realization that the war they had fought was not the war they had been told about. What if we were wrong? Klaus said quietly. Friedrich stared at him.
What did you say? What if we were wrong? Klaus repeated, louder this time. What if everything we were told, about the Americans, about the war, about why we were fighting, what if all of it was a lie? Friedrich stepped toward him, fists clenched. You're a coward. No, Klaus said, standing up to face him. I'm just tired of pretending I don't have questions. The two men stood there, inches apart, breathing hard, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on.
But before Friedrich could respond, Hans spoke again, his voice low and steady. I had a son, Hans said. He was 16 when they conscripted him, sent him to the Eastern Front. I got a letter 6 months later saying he died in Kursk. They didn't even send me his body, just a letter. One paragraph. Died for the fatherland. He paused, his hand shaking. I spent 2 years believing he died for something, that his death meant something, that the war was worth it. He looked up at Klaus, then at Friedrich, then at all of them. But today, when that guard gave me coffee, I realized something. My son didn't die for the fatherland. He died because someone lied to him, just like they lied to us. The room was silent. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. Klaus sat back down on his bunk. He didn't know what to say. None of them did, because Hans had said the thing they were all thinking, the thing they were all too afraid to admit, that the war had stolen everything from them, their youth, their innocence, their certainty, and replaced it with nothing but doubt. By 1944, more than 425,000 German and Italian prisoners of war were held in camps across the United States. They were spread across 46 states, housed in over 500 camps, working on farms, in factories, in forests. The American government had a problem. The country needed labor. Millions of American men were overseas, fighting. The farms still needed to be planted. The factories still needed to run. The war effort required bodies, hands, work, and so the prisoners were put to work, not in chains, not under the lash, but under a system governed by the Geneva Convention, a set of rules that dictated how prisoners of war were to be treated, with dignity, with fairness, with humanity. It was a system that confused the prisoners, because in Nazi Germany, the Geneva Convention was a joke. Soviet prisoners were starved, frozen, worked to death in camps where survival was measured in weeks, not years. The Wehrmacht didn't believe in mercy. They believed in domination, and they assumed their enemies believed the same thing. But here, in America, the prisoners were paid for their work. Not much, 80 cents a day, but it was something. They were given 3 meals a day. They were allowed to send letters home. They were allowed to play sports, to form bands, to stage plays. In some camps, they were even given access to libraries, to classes, to education. It was surreal, Kafkaesque. A war where the losers were treated better than the winners. Klaus was assigned to work on a farm outside of Des Moines, Iowa. The farm was owned by a man named Otto Zimmermann, a second-generation German immigrant whose father had arrived in America in 1898, fleeing military conscription in Bavaria. Otto spoke fluent German. He had grown up speaking it at home, hearing it in church, reading it in the newspapers his father subscribed to. But after 1941, after Pearl Harbor, after America entered the war, Otto stopped speaking German in public. He stopped going to the German Lutheran Church. He stopped subscribing to the German newspapers, because suddenly, being German in America was dangerous. But now, in 1944, Otto found himself supervising German prisoners of war on his own land. The irony was not lost on him. Klaus worked the fields alongside Otto and 3 other prisoners. They planted corn, fixed fences, milked cows. The work was hard, but it was honest. It was clean. It was nothing like the war. One afternoon, Otto brought his thermos to the field and poured coffee for Klaus. Klaus stared at the cup, then at Otto, then back at the cup. "Why?" Klaus asked in broken English. Otto didn't look up. He just shrugged and said, "Because you're thirsty." Klaus took the cup. He drank, and for the first time since his capture, he felt something close to peace. Over the weeks, Klaus and Otto began to talk. Not about the war, not about politics, just about life, about farming, about family, about the small, mundane things that make up a human existence. Otto told Klaus about his father, about the village in Bavaria he had left behind, about the letters he used to send back home until the war made it impossible. Klaus told Otto about his own father, a schoolteacher in Munich, about the books he used to read, about the life he thought he would have before the war swallowed it whole. And slowly, over coffee and conversation, Klaus began to see Otto not as the enemy, but as a man who spoke his language, a man who shared his history, a man who, in another life, in another world, could have been his friend. It was a revelation that shattered everything Klaus thought he knew, because if Otto was human, if Otto was kind, if Otto was decent, if Otto was just a man trying to live his life, then what did that make Klaus? What did that make the war he had fought? What did that make every bomb he had dropped, every order he had followed, every belief he had clung to? The prisoners called it captivity. But for Klaus, it was the first time in years that he had been allowed to think for himself, to see the war from the outside, to question everything he had been told. And once you start questioning, you can't stop. They called it captivity. But for the first time, they were free to think, to see, to question everything they were told. The paradox was impossible to ignore. The moment they became prisoners was the moment they stopped being slaves. In the camps, the prisoners formed communities. They elected representatives. They organized soccer leagues, theater groups, educational classes. They published newspapers, held debates, celebrated holidays. In some camps, they even built small chapels and held religious services, something that had been forbidden in the Wehrmacht, where the only God allowed was Hitler. The American guards watched, bemused. Some of them found it strange that the prisoners seemed happier in captivity than they had been in their own army. But others understood, because many of the guards were the children and grandchildren of German immigrants, men who remembered a time when Germany wasn't a symbol of evil, but just a place their families had come from. They saw the prisoners not as monsters, but as victims of a system that had chewed them up and spit them out. Klaus began to notice something strange. The longer he stayed in the camp, the more he realized how little he had known about the war. In Germany, information was controlled. Newspapers printed only what the government allowed. Radio broadcasts were propaganda. Dissent was treason. But here in America, the prisoners had access to newspapers, to magazines, to radio programs that told the truth about the war. They learned about the Holocaust. They learned about the concentration camps. They learned about the millions of Jews, Poles, Russians, and others who had been murdered in the name of the fatherland. At first, many prisoners refused to believe it. They called it Allied propaganda. They said it was exaggerated, fabricated, designed to make them feel guilty. But as the evidence mounted, as photographs were published, as testimonies were broadcast, as the reality of what had been done in their name became undeniable, the prisoners were forced to confront a horrifying truth. They had been soldiers in an army that committed genocide. Klaus sat in the barracks one night, reading a newspaper article about Auschwitz. His hands were shaking. His vision was blurred. He felt sick. Hans sat down beside him. "You didn't know," Hans said quietly. "Does that matter?" Klaus asked. Hans didn't answer, because the truth was, it didn't matter. Knowing or not knowing, they had all been part of it. They had all worn the uniform. They had all followed the orders. They had all believed the lies. And now, sitting in a prison camp in Iowa, thousands of miles from the war, they had to live with the fact that they had fought for something unspeakable. But here's the other side of the irony. The Americans didn't treat them like monsters. They treated them like men, misguided men perhaps, broken men. Men who had been lied to and manipulated and sent to fight a war they didn't understand. But still men. A guard named James O'Connor, a third-generation Irish immigrant from Boston, a man who had no German blood in him at all, once told Klaus, "You're not evil, you're just human, and humans make mistakes. The question is whether you learn from them." Klaus never forgot that, because it was the first time anyone had given him permission to be more than a soldier, more than a prisoner, more than a Nazi. It was the first time anyone had suggested that he could be something else, that he could change, that he could become better. And slowly, over months and years, many of the prisoners did change. They learned English. They learned about democracy. They learned about a world beyond propaganda and fear. And when the war ended, when they were finally sent home, many of them carried those lessons with them. But some didn't go home. Some stayed, because the Germany they had left no longer existed. The cities were rubble. The economy was destroyed. The country was divided. And for some prisoners, the idea of returning to that devastation was unbearable. So they stayed in America. They married American women. They became American citizens. They built lives in the same towns where they had once been prisoners. And they never forgot the moment when the enemy offered them breakfast and, in doing so, offered them a chance to become human again. Klaus Werner never returned to Germany. When the war ended in 1945, he was given the choice. Go home or stay. He chose to stay. He married a woman named Mary, the daughter of a farmer in Iowa. They had 3 children. He became a teacher again, this time in a small schoolhouse outside Des Moines. He taught history, American history, European history, World War II. His students never knew he had been a German soldier. They never knew he had fought for the Wehrmacht. They never knew he had been a prisoner of war. To them, he was just Mr. Werner, the kind old man with the thick accent who told stories about the past with a sadness in his eyes that no one could quite explain. But every year, on May 15th, Klaus would drive out to the farm where he had worked as a prisoner. Otto Zimmermann had passed away in 1963, but his children still ran the farm. Klaus would park his car at the edge of the field, walk to the spot where Otto had once poured him coffee, and stand there in silence. He never told anyone why he did it, not even Mary, but she understood, because some debts can't be repaid, some moments can't be explained. You can only honor them. In 1982, Klaus was interviewed by a local historian who was writing a book about German POWs in Iowa. The historian asked him what he remembered most about his time as a prisoner. Klaus thought for a long moment. Then he said, "I remember the breakfast, the first one, when we got off the train and they fed us. I remember thinking, this is a trick, this is propaganda, they want to break us. But it wasn't a trick, it was just kindness, and that kindness broke me in a way the war never could, because it forced me to see that the people I had been taught to hate were just people, and if they were just people, then what did that make me? What did that make everything I had believed?" He paused. His hands were shaking. "I came to America as an enemy. I left as a man who understood that the enemy was never the people. It was the lie that we were different." Klaus Werner died in 1987 at the age of 69. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Des Moines, next to Mary, under a headstone that read, "Teacher, husband, father, witness." Witness. That was the word he had chosen for himself, because he had seen the worst of humanity and the best. He had seen what happens when people believe the lies they are told, And he had seen what happens when someone offers you coffee and reminds you that, beneath the uniform, beneath the flag, beneath the ideology, you are still human. He left Germany as a soldier and returned as a witness. The war ended, but its echoes never did. There is a photograph taken in 1945 of a group of German prisoners standing in front of a farmhouse in Iowa. They are smiling. Their uniforms are clean. Their faces are sunburned from working in the fields. Behind them, an American guard leans against the porch railing, a cigarette in his hand, his expression relaxed. If you didn't know the context, you would think it was just a picture of farm workers taking a break. You would never know that these men were enemies, that they had been at war, that, under different circumstances, they would have killed each other. But that's the thing about war. It's never really about the people. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about the people. It's about the lies we believe, the fear we cultivate, the distance we create between us and them. And the moment that distance collapses, the moment you sit across from your enemy and realize they drink coffee the same way you do, that they miss their families the same way you do, that they bleed the same way you do, the war loses its power. The German POWs who came to America in 1944 didn't stop being German. They didn't stop loving their country, but they stopped believing that their country was always right. They stopped believing that the enemy was always evil. They stopped believing that war was the only answer. And that's the most dangerous thing you can teach a soldier. Doubt. Because once you doubt, you start to question. And once you question, you start to see. And once you see, you can't unsee. You can't go back to the way things were. You can't pretend that the enemy is a monster when you've seen them laugh, cry, and pray. You can't pretend that war is glorious when you've seen what it does to the people who fight it. The American policy of treating German POWs humanely was controversial at the time. Many Americans were furious. They wanted revenge. They wanted the prisoners to suffer the way American soldiers were suffering in Japanese camps, in German camps, in the frozen hell of the Eastern Front. They wanted justice. They wanted blood. But the government held firm, because they understood something that many people didn't. That the way you treat your enemies during war determines what kind of peace you have after the war. If you torture, abuse, and dehumanize your prisoners, you create a generation of men who will return home filled with hatred, bitterness, and a desire for revenge. But if you treat your prisoners with dignity, if you show them that there is another way to live, another way to think, another way to be, then you plant the seeds for reconciliation, for healing, for a future that isn't just an endless cycle of violence, and in the case of Germany, it worked. The prisoners who returned home after the war carried with them a memory of America that couldn't be erased by propaganda. They remembered the breakfast. They remembered the coffee. They remembered the guards who spoke their language and treated them like human beings. And when Germany was rebuilt, when democracy was restored, when the country was given a chance to start over, those memories mattered, because they reminded people that there was another way, that the enemy wasn't always the enemy, that kindness, even in the middle of war, was possible. History doesn't repeat itself. It waits for those who forget to listen. And right now, in a world where borders are closing, where fear is rising, where the distance between us and them is widening once again, the story of the German POWs in America is more important than ever. Because it reminds us that the enemy is never as simple as we think, that the people we are taught to hate are just people, that war is not inevitable, that kindness is not weakness, that treating someone with dignity, even when they don't deserve it, is not naive. It's revolutionary. The guard never sleeps, because the moment we stop remembering, the moment we stop questioning, the moment we stop seeing the humanity in the people we are told to hate, the war begins again. Not with bullets, not with bombs, but with the same old lies, the same old fears, the same old stories that convince us that we are different, that we are right, that we are justified in whatever violence we commit. But the truth is simpler than that, and harder. The truth is that we are all the same. We all want to be safe. We all want to be loved. We all want to believe that our lives mean something. And the moment we forget that, the moment we let fear and hatred and propaganda convince us otherwise, we become the very thing we claim to be fighting against. Klaus Werner understood that. Hans understood that. Otto Zimmermann understood that. And the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners who passed through American camps understood that, too. They learned it the hard way, through loss, through suffering, through the slow, painful process of unlearning everything they had been taught. But they learned it, and because they learned it, the world became a little bit better. Not perfect, not healed, but better, and that's all we can ever hope for. That in the middle of the darkness, someone offers you coffee. That in the middle of the war, someone reminds you that you are human. That in the middle of the hatred, someone shows you that there is another way. The Guard never sleeps, and neither should we. There are more stories like this one. Stories buried in archives, forgotten in history books, waiting to be told. If this matters to you, if you believe these voices deserve to be heard, the archive opens every week. Stay with us. Subscribe in Warden of War. Which story should we open next? There are thousands. Some darker, some stranger, some that will make you question everything you thought you knew about war. Tell us below. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, someone who still believes the enemy is always the enemy, share this with them. Because the most dangerous weapon in war isn't a gun, it's a lie, and the only way to disarm it is to tell the truth. The Guard never sleeps.